Hello to everyone who's just joining. Thank you so much for being with us today. My name is Kimberly White. I am a proud PLNU alumna, and I have the privilege of working with the Office of Alumni Relations. Thank you very much for joining us for today's Loma talk. I'm very excited about today's conversation on racial inequality and finding our voices. Today, we are joined by Kim Berry-Jones, an alumna and the director of PLNU's Center for Justice and Reconciliation. We are going to be hearing from the entire staff of the CJR, which I am very thankful for their time in joining us today. And then we will also be hearing a conversation between a few of our alums as well. So again, thank you very much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. I did just want to give a couple of housekeeping tips and let you know what you can expect today. So today's conversation with the Center for Justice and Reconciliation and with our alums, Orin Mozon and Malin Martin, it is a pre-recorded conversation. We previously recorded it just for the ease of planning and getting everybody together at one time. But we are joined live today by Kim Berry-Jones and by Rihanna, who are in the Center for Justice and Reconciliation. So we thank them for joining us live today. And they will be doing some question and answers throughout the presentation. So we will be tuning in to that pre-recorded conversation, but we also invite you to take advantage of the question and answer box that you should see at the bottom of your screen. Go ahead and say hello in there, and please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. And Kim and Rihanna will be answering those questions as we go. Today's presentation is about an hour long, and we want to respect everybody's time, but we're very excited to dig into some really great content. We may answer a few questions live towards the end, but I do encourage you to, throughout the hour, please go ahead and put your questions into that question and answer box that you should see at the bottom. There is also a participant view, so if you want to go ahead and look for that box that should say something like participant view and go ahead and highlight the video, then you'll be able to watch and view that presentation. So again, thank you very much for joining us. I know that it's taken some time out of your busy day. This is, it's been a privilege to hear from many different alums throughout this summer series of Loma Talks, and we've been engaging with one another and learning about several different topics. But this is particularly a conversation that we feel is very important and that we're excited to have. So thank you again very much for joining us. And with that, we will go ahead and turn it over. And we have the privilege of now hearing from Kim Berry-Jones and the team at the Center for Justice and Reconciliation. So thank you.
Hi, welcome to today's Loma Talk. We're so glad to have you here today. My name is Kim Berry-Jones, and I'm the director of the Center for Justice and Reconciliation at Point Loma. And my team is here today with me, and you'll get to meet each of them. But I wanted just to tell you briefly about the Center for Justice and Reconciliation. So our mission at the center is to transform our community through social change. And one of the ways that we love doing that is by walking alongside students and helping to teach them about social engagement through the lens of our faith. And then the other major area that we focus this on is we develop programs that solve complex community problems and bring lasting impact to our community. So a couple of those are the Beauty for Ashes Scholarship. We started that in 2014 as a college scholarship for survivors of human trafficking. And we also developed and launched the No More Human Trafficking Prevention curriculum, which has been seen by over 11,000 people and is targeted to middle and high schoolers through a drama-based performance that helps students understand what it looks like to be recruited into sex trafficking. So those are just a couple of our programs that we have developed and launched in our community. We also focus on other areas like fair trade and worker justice, immigration, and racism. One of our highlights each year is our Wear Justice event, which is a week-long event that helps students look at the fast fashion industry and how they consume products, and helps them rethink through what it means to be a conscious consumer. So we are a busy group and we love the work that we get to do. We don't take it for granted. We feel super honored to be a part of this conversation that's going on right now across our campus about racism. And I wanted to tell you that we as a team are really approaching this subject as learners. We don't see ourselves as experts, but we are each on our own individual journey learning, and we're also working really hard together as a team to learn and grow around how to be an anti-racist. So we're really excited that all of you are joining us today to learn alongside of us. We hope that after this is over, you will take the opportunity to join the CJR alumni group on LinkedIn. It's a great way to connect with other alums who care about these issues, and we are continuing to put out resources and information and network and get to know each other through that group. So please hop onto LinkedIn after and join our group. And with that, I'm going to kick it to the CJR team to talk a little bit about what each of us are personally learning about racial justice and this journey and our role in the conversation.
Hi, my name is Claire Ann Wagner, and I'm the Program Director for Human Trafficking Research and Grants Management at the CJR. So what I've been learning personally about racial justice is that this is the journey that each of us are going to go through differently, and that it's not easy. So you have to be ready to do the hard work, and when I say hard work, it's definitely very hard work. I've been also learning what my role in the conversation is and at times what it isn't. So I'm learning when I need to stand up more for racial injustice and for when I need to sit back and just listen and learn and unlearn and relearn. As a team, we've been reading a book called Me and White Supremacy by Layla Saad, and that has been an incredible resource for me personally because it's helping me unpack my own white privilege and what that means and what that's looked like my whole life. So I would absolutely encourage anybody who might be at the beginning of their journey of learning about this to take a read or take a look at that book. And maybe even if you've already been a part of this journey for a while, I really think it's been a great resource. In addition to that, if you can read it with a group, I think that has also been such a great thing for me because I can process what I'm learning with people I care about. And thankfully, as a team, we've been able to do that. So as I said, this is not an easy conversation to have with people. And I'm also learning that being challenged and seeking that discomfort is something that needs to be done. And that while you're in those conversations, you're not always going to have the right answers, and that's okay. So that's where I'm at in this journey, and I will kick it on to the next team member to share a little bit more.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Elliot. I'm currently the part-time assistant for our No More program, which is a human trafficking prevention and awareness curriculum. So I'm a third culture kid, which means my parents are both white Americans, but they grew up abroad, and then I was born and raised in Guatemala. So I grew up with an appreciation of other cultures and an opportunity to see that there's different ways of being and different ways of living. And yet, in spite of that, and also in some ways maybe because of being part of a missionary family, I also definitely grew up with a white savior mentality. So this idea that like white American culture is somehow inherently better than other cultures, and that my job as a white American person is to go and help fix or change other people. And I think the book that helped open my eyes to that, which I now see how that is actually incredibly disrespectful and offensive in many ways. But the book that helped me see that was the book Walking with the Poor, which I really recommend. Another book that I read that I feel like really opened my eyes, which actually isn't even specifically directly about racism, is the book Blink by Malcolm Gladwell. He talks about implicit bias and specifically in police interactions and how those split-second decisions that police officers have to make. And so actually a great resource, the book itself is a great resource, but within that he talks about the Harvard implicit bias test. So you can actually, if you're interested, you can test your own implicit bias around racism, around a whole bunch of things, but there is one that's specifically black-white dynamic, and you can test your own implicit race bias at implicit.harvard.edu.
Hi, I'm Luz, and I'm the program coordinator for the Center for Justice and Reconciliation. My personal journey with racism has really been more eye-opening than I thought. So a little bit of background is I'm Mexican-American. I have dual citizenship and have grown up in both countries. So in a way, I've been kind of able to assimilate to American culture. And I think in many groups, I get to sneak in and people don't realize that I'm Mexican, and I'm not really treated like a Mexican. And that's something that I've learned during this journey, that because of that, being able to assimilate, I've been able to dip into white supremacy, or I guess it could be lighter skin supremacy, and benefit off of that, which I used to think that just for the simple reason of being Mexican, that I wasn't part of all of that problem and systemic issue that we have to really change. So for the first time, I'm realizing that I do have a voice in this and in changing it, and I'm on the opposite side of the problem than I thought it was. So it's been very eye-opening in that sense. And I used to think that it was because I didn't see things through a racial lens, and that's why I wasn't being targeted. But in reality, it's just I have this assimilation shield that kind of protects me, because I think a lot of racial tensions isn't just about skin color. It goes into the cultural norms that are acceptable and aren't. And I've been able to sneak in because I know how I should behave, and I've benefited off of that. So it's been quite a journey in learning how I do need to take a stance, and I do need to change in many different ways too, and how I'm interacting with the issue.
So I'm Rihanna Contreras. I'm our program director of community relations. And my biggest takeaway in this area is that racial justice is not their issue for people of color to deal with. Instead, white privilege, which is a system that oppresses others, is something that I inherently benefit from and am personally complicit in, which makes it my problem. And I've noticed my white peers tend to condemn that one racist person who did that thing without acknowledging the ways that we all participate in racism and have implicit and explicit biases. There's not racist or non-racist people. We all participate to some degree. So my recent focus has been on continuing the practice of anti-racism. And I realized that becoming an ally isn't something you achieve. It's something you practice over time. And part of my white privilege is being able to check out of this conversation. So I have to commit to reflecting on the ways that my prejudice shows up in my everyday life and the way I've been conditioned to see the world through a lens of white superiority. And I have to intentionally break those patterns to see change over time. So one way I've been doing that is by decolonizing the information I consume and incorporating people of color into my bookshelf, my watch list, my podcast, social media feed, LinkedIn, like whatever field you're in, there are incredible people of color speaking on that topic. And so I've noticed by intentionally following, reading, and watching perspectives from people of color, it really reframes how I see the world and how I experience life events. So my challenge is not getting it right all the time, because I won't and I don't, but continuing to move forward and having those hard conversations with close friends and family. And I'm still working on all those and doing that better, but I'm making it an ongoing practice in my life.
Hello, my name is Jessica Kim, and I am the Student Success Coordinator with the Center for Justice and Reconciliation. I I am also a survivor of trafficking and a woman of color. So having lived in oppression for most of my life, I know and recognize the systems are intended to support people having the opposite effect and have instead been built to keep people of color oppressed. Racism is complex, and for my brothers and sisters of the African American community, it is living in pain and suffering on a daily basis. We need to do better. We need to be better. And so one way that I have tried to get further educated on racism in the United States, because I was born in Mexico. And so I wanted to find out how was the United States built? How was this nation built? So I began reading They Were Her Property, White Women of Slave Owners in the American South. This book is by Stephanie Jones Rogers, and it is going back to the root of how white women were part of the slave movement and were slave owners in our nations. And so I think we need to begin at that root of, what is the root cause to begin to unravel the whole racism issue. And I believe that is one way to begin. I also think opening up the spaces for people of color to not only be used as tokenism, but as of people with experience, and also being careful doing our own learning, so not depending on people of color to teach the white people about racism, but having that individualized learning process for each of us. It's really, really important. So I think that's what I wanted to share.
So I've been learning about my privilege and the reality that I get to choose when I engage with this issue, while my friends of color and people of color live with the reality of racism every day. And really, until I started doing this work, I hadn't heard the word or the term anti-racist, or understood that there's a difference between being against racism, which hopefully we can all say that we are against racism. There's a difference between that and being anti-racist. Being anti-racist is a lifelong process of actively looking for ways to be a better ally to people of color. And it's a lifetime commitment to keep looking at the ways that my white privilege is harming others and keeps others from what they deserve. So I'm learning that I have to keep trying, even when I mess up, that I can apologize and commit to do better. And I'm learning that my fear of not doing it right all the time is actually an excuse not to look more closely at racism in my life. And it keeps me from those moments where the deep learning actually happens for me. So it's painful, but it's more painful to me to keep on living, not paying attention to racism, and to being committed to being anti-racist, because I am seeing more clearly every day the deep pain around me that racism causes. So thanks to the members of the CGR team who joined us today to share a little bit about their journey. And with that, I'm going to kick it on back to Rihanna, who is going to introduce a conversation with two of our wonderful alums that I think will be a really beautiful moment today.
Okay, so in the spirit of listening to voices of color, we have two incredible PLNU alumni who are joining us to share a little bit of their experience and the path that they have taken to find their unique voice in the conversation about racial justice. So we have Orin Mozon, who I grew up in the same hometown with and became friends with in youth group, where he learned to play guitar. And so it's been so fun watching him grow as a worship leader and now serve on staff as the music director at Upper Room Denver. So thanks for joining us, Orin. Yeah. And then we have Malin Martin, who I recently had the pleasure of meeting virtually. but there's just a special bond between people who actually enjoy spending time with middle school students. So I feel connected to you already because of the time that I spent as a children's director and volunteering in youth group. There's just something unique about people who actually enjoy that. But Malin works in student ministries at New Life Community Church in Pismo Beach. So thank you two so much for joining us. It's so good to hear from you two. And I'm especially excited to hear your perspective because I think you both have a really unique story and perspective as we talk about race and understand our roles in this conversation. For example, Orin, I have known you for a while now, and I've had the privilege of watching you find your voice and in this conversation and grow over the years, and I've seen kind of a recent shift. So I'm super interested to hear you speak more about that. But the first question I definitely want to direct toward Malin. So could you tell us at what point did you decide that your presence in this conversation was necessary?
Yeah, at the end of my sophomore year of my time at Point Loma, I actually had a white friend of mine, sit with me, and he said, Malin, what has your experience been with all this stuff? Like, what has your experience been like? You're a Black person, you're one of my best friends, and I don't know how you feel about these things. And I didn't know how to respond because I had never taken the time to actually process my own experience. I grew up in a predominantly white area with predominantly white institutions, and then had just transitioned into another predominantly white institution when I went to Point Loma. So I never really took the time to pay attention. But that summer, I took some time while I was staying in Young over the summer. I took some time in my dorm room just to figure out, like, what has been going on in my life? What has this looked like for me? And it was like it almost felt like the Holy Spirit had just began to unlock memories inside of me that I didn't even recognize as racism. And so it felt like memory after memory of just traumatizing experience of being called names, of being treated unfairly, and being the butt of every joke. So many racist interactions defined my childhood, and I didn't know what to do with that. I just knew that it hurt really bad. And very shortly after that, honestly, maybe even the same day, I had seen online something that my mom had posted. Actually, she is a white woman, and she posted a story on her Instagram account of how her brother is a cop, but her children are Black, and she didn't know really how to take a side in the matter. She just felt like, at this point, love is the answer, and we just need to love each other better. And so she used a lot of that language that we see floating around Christians today. And at the end, she hashtagged every human being matters. And it felt like a dagger to the heart. I knew that her intentions were pure, but the impact made me feel like I didn't actually matter. And in that moment, I realized that all of my silence for really my entire childhood, even into my early adulthood, my silence, which I had been using as a means of surviving racism, was actually misinterpreted by the white majority as permission. And so every time someone had said something racist in front of me or done something racist in front of me, and I was silent because I wanted to survive it, those people mistook my silence for permission and thought, well, it must not be racist because there's a Black person right here and she didn't say anything. And that was the moment where I realized, okay, from here on out, I have to speak up. I can't afford to be silent. My relationship with my mom is on the line now. And so I realized that a lot of the racism I had experienced had come from the people who loved me most, which were white friends and family members. And at that point, I just knew, okay, this is my line in the sand. And from this point forward, I have to speak up and I can't stay silent. And that's when it started for me.
For me, there's been like the long story and then the short version of the story. Like the long story is in the whole experience of my life. Kind of like what Malin was saying, is experiencing racism on both the blatant level but also the subtle level my whole life, and just wanting to survive it. and just not make a big deal about it, not make it a race thing or whatever, even though it very much was, but feeling in the circles that I grew up in, also similarly very predominantly white most of my life. Like I had a good bit of my life was spent in a Black community with my family and extended family. But then there was another chunk of my life, like at school, and when I moved, because I lived in North Carolina, I lived in Seattle, and I lived in California, San Diego, Oceanside, to be exact. And both, they all had an element of diversity, but with my dad being a military family, or my dad being in the military, we would often be in predominantly white places, like on military bases or in the schools we were in, whatever. And so I kind of my whole life had learned, or had been, I don't even want to say learned, like it's a good thing. I had been misled to believe that I wasn't allowed to talk about my Blackness, essentially, because the people that I saw around me didn't know how to talk about it. So I was like, okay, if they don't know how to talk about it, then I probably shouldn't talk about it, because that's just uncomfortable for everyone. And I think for the sake of everyone's comfort, I learned to also silence my own voice in this. And I think in the last few years, especially as different police brutality things have come up in our culture, I've both learned what I actually think and also learned how to dialogue about that in like private conversations. But with the George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery happening most recently, both of those became a lot more public of a discussion across the board. White people, Black people, everyone in between, churches, non-Christians, everyone in between. And I just started to see like, hey, if we're having this conversation now, like I should be a part of it, because I actually have a lot of thoughts and a lot of experience with this. And I actually think I also have a lot of grace for it too, because I think that a lot of the expression that I'd seen has been, it's either like Malima was saying, it's like love's the only answer, which is true, but it can also negate the problem if we just slap a love stamp on it. So I feel like the Lord has uniquely prepared me in my whole life to have grace for the conversation, but also have maybe some boldness that I didn't really express before. So if anything, I've become more outspoken, like on social media specifically, just because it's a platform and everyone has a voice right now. So like, why can't we have voices too? And it's been really cool to step into that. But I've never wanted to make that be the only avenue of speaking. Like I still care so much about personal conversations and one-on-ones and small group conversations, stuff like that. So yeah.
Yeah. And as you've become more active and present in the conversation, what has that looked like and what kind of response have you experienced?
Yeah. It's been a lot. There is both in the good and the bad sometimes. Like for me, being here in Denver, there's been a lot of different protests happening, and again, it's been unfortunate, but a lot of what the media portrays as the protests happening is that they're all violent and there's a lot of chaos, when actually I've actually been down at a few of them. And I shared a story about how I went down to the Denver Capitol and kind of got involved in one of the protests happening, the rallies is happening there. I even think the word protest sounds like it's like this big aggressive thing. It's really just a rally of people getting together to at least in our experience here, just to kind of share what they're going through. And so at one point I got on a megaphone and kind of shared about the hope that I even had in the midst of all this craziness. And so that's been an area that I've stepped in, and being a part of different rallies over the last few weeks. And there was one down at the Aurora Police Department, which is, if you've heard the name Elijah McClain, that was where he was killed. And so that's about 20 minutes from where I live. So there was a peaceful protest down there. And so just being a part of it, not really having like a leadership position necessarily, but just knowing, hey, I'm a leader. I've been groomed as a leader my whole life in the church. And so I have this gifting that enabled me to kind of step into a position out there. And a lot of people are like, what organization are you with? Like, who are you representing? I'm like, I'm not, like, I'm here. I just want to be a voice and like be an ear to people that are out here. So that's been kind of a place I've stepped into, is the rallies and the protests and the discussions, and there's a whole wide range of emotion out there, but just trying to find a place to just listen and being out there, and also encourage people to be honest and to be authentic, but also try to bring some kind of, I don't know, structure and clarity, because I mean, a lot of people have been saying this recently, but especially the Black Lives Matter movement, it can look like a very leaderless movement, because there's so many people getting involved. And so I saw that firsthand, and even in the way that I had to step up was because there was no one really leading it, and there's people that wanted to talk. There was a crowd of 1,000 or more people. I was like, someone has to facilitate something. So that's kind of been a place that I've stepped into, and then also learning how to dialogue with specifically white leaders in my community and churches throughout the Denver area, and even back in San Diego as well.
Yeah, I think it's looked a few different ways throughout my time, like since my sophomore year when I decided to get involved. I feel like my presence has morphed in different ways throughout different seasons, but in the beginning, my presence in the conversation really just looked like calling out my family, having hard conversations with my family, and then having hard conversations with my friends. It was really challenging at Point Loma, then going into like my junior year, where I would have conversations with my friends and tell them about the hard conversation that I had just had with my family, and they would go, well, are you sure they meant it that way? Like, are you sure they were trying to be racist? Like, was that really what was going on? And feeling like I had to defend myself to my friends, or to like further educate my friends with what was going on. It was just complicated, and that's really the space that I lived in for about a year. And then at the end of my junior year, I feel like is when I started getting involved in conversations at Point Loma, like panel discussions on race. And that year I also started writing, I believe it was that year, it might have been the following year, my junior or senior year, I started writing essays for Black History Month, where I started to realize that a lot of my friends had no idea that February was Black History Month. And I was shocked, because that's my favorite month of the year and has been since I was a little girl when I learned about Black History Month. And so I decided that none of my friends would have the excuse of not knowing when Black History Month was. And so I just decided that every February I'd start writing essays about my experience and share my story essay by essay. And those, in the first year, I had like a handful of people that were really interested. And then the following year, which I believe was 2019, so last year, when I wrote essays, people from all over the place started reading them. Like extended family members started sharing them in their schools that they were teaching at. And there were a lot of people that were reading them that I didn't know and didn't have like an immediate grasp to, or didn't even know their names. And so they grew in that way. And I think I presented myself, unbeknownst to me, as a resource for people. And so then conversations started happening at a greater level, where people, I feel like I experienced a little less pushback and a little bit more of the curiosity from my friends and family, who originally would probably push back on me more. But I think that's really powerful. That's the power of a story. I think when we come into situations like this with just strictly opinions or even statistics, I think it's really difficult for people to buy into racism or anti-racist work. But when you share a story and it comes from a real face and a real body and a real person and a real heart that experienced real pain, it's much more difficult for someone to look at me and say, no, Malin, you didn't experience that. When really, like, no one can tell me that I didn't experience what I just experienced. And so telling my story has been a huge part of my presence in the conversation. And in this season in particular, it's been interesting sharing my stories in the context of white church and in the context of protests. Similarly to Orin's experience, I've been involved in a few protests and spoken at some candlelit vigils and things like that. And it's interesting, there's a bit of nuance that happens in how I have this conversation with my white church and how I have this conversation with, like, alongside other Black community leaders at protests and things like that. There's nuance and difference in how I hold the conversation with whichever group I'm with. But it has looked a lot like telling my story.
Now, I'm super curious because you two are both in ministry. So what do you think? What's your perspective on the role of the church in this conversation? What response have you seen or would you like to see from church leadership and people of faith?
Man, I think I would love to see more involvement, just all around the board. Especially in the things that are happening just in the streets of Denver, there is a severe lack of the church's presence, both in numbers as well as just words. Like what's being expressed, what is being spoken, like from a stage or from a platform or whatever. It's not really kingdom. And I think that we, as the church, should be involved in that. I'm not a history person at all, so I get facts wrong all the time, and I'm always down to learn things. But when I think about what I do know about the civil rights movement is that, man, it was led by the church. Like Martin Luther King, he was Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., So he was a leader in that time, and whether it was popular or not, like, we don't really know the popular opinion of the time. We just know what kind of happened. And man, it was coming from church. He was speaking at churches. There were churches opening their doors and that were accepting people, that were pushing forward change. And I feel like because of our inexperience with something this thick and this heavy, because I mean, in the 60s there was segregation, like, blatant at that time. So churches were experiencing segregation. So they were like, this is part of our world. So we should know how to speak into it. And so we see that in a way. But now, man, like, what we're finding is that people don't know or believe that racism still exists. So no one really knows how to talk about it. So on one end, it kind of makes sense that the church is taking a back seat, because they're like, I've never had to think about this stuff. And I think that's an issue, first of all. But so there's some understanding that I have for the church as a whole, but also specifically the white church, because like there are predominantly black churches. Also, I don't really love having to call it a white church versus black church. That's another issue. But there's things that this is part of where we're at. So I would love to see churches get more involved, even if all it was just learning how to have conversations with people that didn't look like them. And so I've been having beautiful conversations with pastors in the city that I have relationship with, that have been really eye-opening for both of us, because I'm learning, oh, this is your experience. Oh, this is how you never even saw my experience. And cool, now we can work together to do this side by side.
Yeah, conversations are so key. Lillian, what do you think?
I think I feel like I have like a love-hate relationship with the church's response. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, I feel like this is the most available the church has ever been to listen to my experience and to seek out my response and to listen to what I have to say. And I feel really empowered by the church on the one hand. But on the other hand, I still feel like this unbearable pressure to water down my experience or to water down my pain for the sake of white Christian feelings. And there's this incessant need or request that sometimes is outright spoken to me and like requested verbally, and then sometimes is just more subtle. But there's this request that I think about wooing white Christians into heart change through the Holy Spirit, which is absolutely the goal. The goal is absolutely to see a heart change in the lives of racists to become anti-racist. That's absolutely the goal. But I think a lot of people, in the face of feeling convicted, have felt uncomfortable with their conviction, and so asked for a kinder presentation for the conversation. And that is just a lot, honestly, to ask for from Black people who have been carrying around pain for so long and have been asking to be listened to for so long. And now that people are finally listening to us. There's like it's so much more work to wrap it up pretty in a bow and then present it in a format that's like comfortable for white Christians. And so I've been dealing with a lot of just inner turmoil, trying to figure out how to navigate that. But I've also been increasingly frustrated with the response of like, well, racism is bad, but we just need to love each other better. And racism is bad, but the riots are causing division. And racism is bad, but I can't support a response that's not peaceful. And I think it's just completely inappropriate for Christians to acknowledge racism and then denounce our methods of combating it. It's like that I keep hearing all over the place is this isn't unifying, we just need unity right now. And I just don't think unity is possible without equity. And so we have to pursue equity before we can even bring unity to the conversation, because the conversation will never be unified if we don't all take up an equal space in the conversation. And so I've been like frustrated with things like that. And I think people have been focusing a lot on concepts of God's love while neglecting God's justice. And I think God's love and God's justice are utterly connected. And we can't say that we love someone if we're not willing to stand up for them in the face of danger. And likewise, if we preach a God who loves the oppressor but doesn't also defend the oppressed, then we preach a white man's God, and that God doesn't even exist. And so I think we've been living into an idol of this white Jesus who is only the Prince of Peace when he's calming the waters and calming the storms and making everything still. I think that's white Jesus. I think that's an aspect of the Prince of Peace, but that's not the whole of the Prince of Peace, because Jesus is still the Prince of Peace when he's flipping tables in the temple because people have put the empire before their God. And I feel in this season, I'm experiencing a lot of white Christians who hold the America First mentality, which is just like that empire before my God. And that's the reason Jesus is flipping tables in the temple. And I feel like in this season, it's our Prince of Peace who's not white, who's flipping tables right now, and who's protesting with us and marching with us in the streets chanting Black Lives Matter. And he's resting in our homes and riding with us in our passenger seat, and he's present for our first breath and our last breath. And he loves all people, both the racist sinner and the anti-racist saint. But I think because God's love is utterly connected to his justice, like the God who loves that racist sinner will still demand justice for the victim of racism. And that often requires consequence, even for the people that he loves. And I think that's challenging for Christians to work with right now, white Christians in particular, because they're wrestling for the first time ever with the fact that, okay, God loves sinners. God has, like, Jesus died for sin. Jesus redeemed sin. There's so much grace, but also there's still very much consequence for sin. There's still very much consequence. And I think people neglect the fact that the consequence of our sin is real pain and real hurt that the victims of racism are experiencing. And some of that includes the loss of life. People are literally dying in the streets. And some of that just includes broken hearts from those of us who have experienced microaggressions or the more subtly friendly forms of racism that still hurt like crazy and cut so deep. But all in all, like, God will demand justice for the pain that was caused. And I think that's really difficult for a lot of white Christians to wrap their brain around right now. And because of that, they've been asking for this pretty presentation of anti-racism, but because it's such a messy, painful conversation, there's no pretty format. There's no pretty presentation of the conversation. It's going to be messy. And I think that's the beauty of the gospel, is that the gospel gets down in the dirt. The gospel is messy, and the gospel reaches deep for redemption and healing in those moments of sheer pain. And I think where there's justice, there's also healing, but we can't get there without the justice. And I think that has been really confusing for a lot of white Christians because we've been holding white Jesus as our idol for so long. And I think what I would love to see out of the church is an uprooting of that idol and a pursuit of the real God, the real Jesus, who is both love and justice and peace, all in the same. And I think that when we pursue him, then we'll see a lot more healing.
Yeah. Even to add on to that, man, when I think about what does the church need to do in response, I think Melinda said a lot of it, but just to add to it, there is like, we need to see Jesus for who he is. I think that's what she was alluding to, but I think even for me, like my story is kind of that I grew up with the notion that Jesus was this kind white man. You know, that's how I learned him to be as a child. Even growing up in a black family, that's kind of, and not like from my parents would have never said that, but in the churches that I was in the private Christian schools that I was in, he was portrayed that way, even just in like images. And there's lots of popular pictures going around of people like art, like drawing and painting Jesus, and they're usually like, he looks like one of like a white American essentially. But to remember that Jesus was a Jewish man in the Middle East, and like, even to think about he's coming back as a Jewish man who's probably going to be brown, you know, and there has been this unraveling even in myself of who actually is Jesus. And even in the last few weeks, like a few weeks ago, I felt like the Lord was speaking to me and was like, when I was thinking about all this racial stuff and the oppression and the conflict and the tension that I've been wrestling with inside, I felt like I heard Jesus say like, I get it. And like my first response to that, unfortunately, was like, okay, but he couldn't. But then it's like, wait a second. Jesus was born into like political tension, ethnic tension. Like he sat in it. You think of the woman at the well from Samaria, yeah. And that was like racial tension that he sat in, but that he also like went forward in and leading reconciliation in. And so like when we begin to see Jesus as that, then that's when all this conversation makes sense, I think, in a way that it hasn't made sense before, because yeah, white Jesus is threatened when these things come up, because he can't really stand up, like white Jesus can't stand up against racial tension and dysfunction, because he's the white Jesus. But the real Jesus, the Jewish brown man from the nation of Israel, like he can probably understand that a little bit more. And so like even in my own personal life, having to see Jesus as that and kind of unlearn some things that I'd learned growing up has been a process. And I think that it's a process that we all should go on. Like maybe it hits me more personally than it would for a white person, but that doesn't mean that it's a similar journey that we have to understand. Like, because like, I don't know, to only picture at the Savior as a 5'6" white man, like that's comfortable, you know. But to 5'6", like actually probably too short for how I like view him. But when you think about actually maybe he was that small and dark and brown and rugged, and it's like, could that have been our Savior? And yeah, I think it could have been, because he was fully God and fully man, and he looked like the people of his time, I would assume, you know, like we don't really know, but just to not be threatened by our idea of Jesus being expanded, and by our idea of God and justice and love and the Holy Spirit and comfort and all that stuff being expanded. It's not a bad thing. I think we think it's a bad thing because it maybe challenges some things, and then we're like, oh my gosh, are we deconstructing our faith? It's like, I don't know that's a bad thing sometimes.
Yeah, on a similar note, Orin, I think something that I'm starting to realize is the church has, I think, assigned the Holy Spirit credit to things that are actually credit of white privilege a lot of the time. I think that a lot of white Christians and white churches have assumed that they're blessed by the Holy Spirit, either financially or with opportunity or whatever you may call it. But in reality, a lot of that blessing that they've received is a result of their white privilege. And a lot of Black leaders or Black Christians or predominantly Black churches would not or could never imagine receiving a blessing like that, because it's really just a result of privilege and not necessarily the Holy Spirit. And I would love to see the church rise up in a way that isn't concerned in protecting privilege, but is concerned in really encountering who the real Spirit is. And I think it's scary to admit or to say out loud, like, man, we as the church, we don't really know who God is. But I think it's actually more honoring to the fact that God is massive, and there are absolutely aspects of God that we understand and that we can get to know and that are knowable. But the reality is that God is so big that most of who God is mystery. And I think we honor God when we humble ourselves to admit, man, we don't know who you are. Show us who you are, because we want to know. But man, I want the real thing. Like, I don't want to fake God. I don't want to fake Jesus. I don't want to fake Holy Spirit. Like, I only want what's real. And I think a lot of our generation in particular, I think a lot of millennials, a lot of Gen Z are going, man, we don't want your fake God. We want the real thing. And if the real thing isn't love and justice, then we don't want anything to do with it. And I think that's part of the reason we're seeing young people leave the church in droves, is because they're starting to recognize, man, this doesn't feel real. This doesn't feel real. Like, there's no way that this is the God y'all have been worshiping for so long. And it's not. It's why Jesus. And so I'm excited to see what happens. I think when we do humble ourselves and get rid of those idols and start to pursue God for who God is. But I think it's going to be challenging to get the church at large on the same page to admit, man, we don't know as much as we want to know, or as much as we think we know.
And it's surely a moment of reckoning within the church to acknowledge the oppression and racism that the church has inflicted on its own people throughout the years. So I think it's definitely a moment for the church to decide to intentionally engage and really wrestle through our history and our past, and then move forward in a very different way. Yeah, this is huge. Well, let's get practical. What advice do you two have for people trying to engage in the conversation around race?
I can start and open up this. But I know one of the key principles in becoming anti-racist or in creating an anti-racist lifestyle is confronting your racist family members and your racist friends, which is really scary for some. It was really scary for me, but I know that just like, for some examples, some practical examples, the first time I ever called out racism in my family, I was sitting on a couch, my mom and uncle were in the room, and they made a really racist joke. And it was the first time in my life that I had been like cognizant of, this is not okay, and if I stay silent, they're going to think this is okay. I can't stay silent, but I'm so crippled in this moment, I can't bring myself to speak up. And so I actually stayed silent through the whole moment. And then about an hour later, I was with my mom, and it was just me and her, and that's when I built up the courage, because I knew my voice wouldn't be outnumbered. We were just one-on-one. I knew that there was love in the car, regardless of how it was about to be challenged. I knew that there was love in this car between me and my mom. And I just took a deep breath and went, Mom, remember like an hour ago when you and your brother were making this joke and you guys were laughing about it? It made me feel really uncomfortable. There's a lot going on in the world right now. I'm still trying to process where my shoe falls in it all. And it would make me feel so much better if you guys just toned down those jokes. Like, I would just really appreciate it if those jokes stopped. And I was met with a lot of defensiveness. She said, your uncle made that joke. I was just there. And I just interrupted her and said, Mom, you laughed at the joke. You were a part of the joke. Regardless of the intention, I'm just asking that it stops. And so that was really important for me to say, like, it really doesn't matter what you meant. I'm just asking that you don't do it again. That was really helpful. Another thing that was really helpful for me was in the middle of like big family gatherings like Thanksgivings or Christmases or holidays where you're spending a lot of time with a lot of family. I kept a list of racist things that were said over a given weekend. I think it was Thanksgiving. But I kept a list of quotes that my family members had said that were absolutely racist. and didn't call any of it out in the moment, but took the time a couple days later when we were farther removed to sit down with my mom and just read her back all of the things that were written on the list. And she didn't have the emotional capacity to defend anything that was said because we were so far removed from it, that all she had were these like really atrocious things being read back to her. And that's when she started crying. She was like, who do I need to apologize to? How do I make this better? And I just said, Mom, I know that you love me, but from here on out, I'm going to start calling this out in the moment, and I need you to let the whole family know. And so that was really helpful for me to have my mom there, who was not necessarily on my side, was not necessarily someone who was participating with me in calling it out, but who I knew would take up my cause for the sake of me, not necessarily because she believed in it. And at that point, she just gave a general warning to my family to let them know I'd be calling it out in the moment. And I think that was really helpful, because then I wasn't blindsiding people, but they were prepared. They knew what they were getting themselves into every time they made a racist joke. And it took a while, but it's been 3 years now, and I can't remember the last time someone said something racist in front of me at a family gathering. So start slow, ease into it, take your time. There's no rush. Like, you definitely want to start ASAP, but there's no rush to like defeat racism in your family tomorrow. It's a long process. It'll take some time.
Yeah, I think keeping it personal, I think makes so much of a difference. Even like with the things that I've shared on social media, I've really just talked from my own perspective. And like, I just, both because of the knowledge that I have and also the care that I have, I choose not to get into the political realm of things, and I share my story. I'll acknowledge, hey, there's a lot of stuff happening, but I don't get into that. I just make it personal. And I've seen so much, like, even on social media, heart change. Like, people reaching out over like direct message or text. And like, even one of the ones that I remember the most was when I just shared about the idea behind the phrase Black Lives Matter, like not even the organization, because they're very different things. Like, when I just shared about that sentiment, I had someone message me later like, hey, I was having this conversation with my family. He's a white guy. He's having a conversation with his white family about like, do Black Lives Matter or do all lives matter? Like, what is it? Like that age old debate. And he said, and I brought out your post and read it to my family, and I started crying. And it was the first time that I actually realized what it meant, because I made it personal. Like, he knows me, I know him. And like, that is what I think, that's where progress happens. It's like, it's realizing behind the movement, behind the whatever politics, however things are being used and manipulated or whatever, behind all that, there are people that are hurting, that are that have been mistreated, that have just been affected by racism in our world. And to not try to make it this big idea of like, okay, well, is racism the leading thing in our nation? No, it's probably not, but it's still there. And to realize that it affects individuals like me, like Malin, like our families, like, to realize that, I think it makes a lot of progress by just realizing that, because from then you realize you're not just dealing with this political movement or these ideas that you can't do anything about. You're dealing with people. And then when you deal with people, then you know how to maybe sit with them better. And I think that's what's practical. And also to realize that even in that, making it personal, is to remember, and this is me kind of defending myself a little bit, remember that out of predominantly white circles, there probably are there, because they're predominantly white, they're like, even in my own circles, like, I'm the only Black person that a lot of people know. And to realize that comes with a certain weight in this conversation, because I feel like I'm having to speak up for all Black people, and I can't. Like, I can't speak for Malin. we share experiences, we share some similar stories, but at the end of the day, I'm speaking up for myself. And to realize that even when you make it personal, that personal story doesn't apply to all. I think that's really important.
Yeah, even on that personal note, I think it's really tempting for a lot of white people these days to recognize, like, oh shoot, I don't have very many Black friends. Like, I don't know very many Black people. So I've experienced this. I know from previous conversations that Orin's experienced this too, but people from like out of the woodworks that I haven't spoken to in like 6 years are DMing me or calling me or texting me, asking me how I'm doing. in light of the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. And it's honestly so uncomfortable because I don't have relationship with these people to buffer the vulnerability. And so I think there's a wave of feeling that like we need to check in on our Black friends, but a lot of people are realizing they don't have many Black friends. And so those of us who are like the one Black person that a lot of white people know, I think a lot of us are being overwhelmed by messages from people who we don't talk to or don't know well anymore. And so when it comes to building friendships and creating boundaries, if you are a white person and you're like, man, how do I interact with more Black people or get more Black people in my corner or around me and rubbing shoulders with them, my first word of advice is get to know them aside from race, aside from how they're experiencing this whole Black Lives Matter movement. Ask them what their favorite color is. Ask them about their family. How many siblings do they have? Get to know them as an individual before you knock on the Black Lives Matter door or before you knock on the racism door, because it's so vulnerable and it's so taxing and exhausting for us. That it's really difficult if there's not like a friendship to buffer it. So in terms of making friends that don't look like you, start hanging out in places that are predominantly brown or Black and don't have a lot of white people. Hang out in a park or meet someone in a coffee shop, things like that. You got to get risky, and I think that's scary for people outside of college because we suddenly are thrown into the world and don't know how to make friends. But like, take the risk and do it in a way that doesn't demand vulnerability from Black people right away. That's my biggest tip in terms of that. Do you have anything to add to that, Orin?
No, that's awesome. I wish everyone could hear that because it would protect both of our time so much in our just emotions.
Yeah. And then the last practical piece that I would give is we've been talking a lot about this white God, how to deconstruct the white God or the white Jesus that you've known your whole life and where to go from there. My biggest tip is prayer. I love to journal, and I spent a lot of time in this season just sitting down in my journal asking God questions like, God, who are you? What do you care about? Where are you in all of this? Do you care about any of this? Do you think that Black Lives Matter? What is your heart in all of this? And where's the way forward? And I feel pretty alone in all of this, and I don't really know what's going on, but I want to know you. And I think too often for my whole life, I've approached the throne room of God assuming that I know exactly who's sitting on that throne. And on the one hand, there's power in that to know that like we are sons and daughters and we know that it's our Father who sits on that throne. But at the same time, there's also a power in going, man, I'm stepping into this throne room and I have no idea what God sits on that throne. I have no idea what power he wields or what he holds in his heart. I don't know who this God is, but I want to. And so approaching the throne room in humility, just asking God questions. I don't think God gets offended by our questions. I don't think God's intimidated by our curiosity or by our capacity to not know. I think God is honored in that. I think we honor the vastness of who God is when we admit that we don't know God as well as we thought we did or as well as we want to.
Man, that's a lot to think about. There's so many things that you two said that just I could reflect on that for a long time. So I really, really can't say enough how much I respect and appreciate your time, your perspective, your individual voices, and sharing into this conversation. I know it's hard and it's a rough conversation in our world right now, but I really appreciate the wisdom that you two have shared and spoken into it. I could listen to you two all day, and there's so much more that we could cover, but just not enough time. So I just want to wrap up by saying if anyone listening is new to this conversation, what I would say is just don't let this be your last one. Continue the conversation. Don't stop here. There have never been more resources so readily available at our fingertips to continue learning and growing. And we'll send out a sheet of action items with all the resources mentioned through this little webinar, but take the next step wherever you are. Just keep moving forward, listen to lots of different voices with empathy to understand what it's like to walk in their shoes and live in a world with a different perspective. It's such an important conversation, so let's make sure it continues. But thank you both for your time. It was so good to hear from you.
Thank you for having us. This is awesome.
Wow, I took a lot of notes and so many good things to think about. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I really appreciate everyone tuning in. Huge thank you to Rihanna for organizing this, for her leadership in putting on this webinar. Thank you so much to the entire CJR team and to my alumni office colleagues. I think that at the end, Rihanna said it perfectly, that this conversation needs to continue, and we're all here and we're ready. Know that that there's a community here that is ready to listen, and that we're here to hold the grief and the lament, but also hope, and how great that we can bring all of that to the throne room and to Jesus as well. So thank you very much. As Rihanna mentioned, we will be emailing out a resource list in just a little bit after this, so stay tuned for that. And thank you again for joining us today. Bye-bye now.